Welcome back, everyone. We're going to do something just a little bit different in this video. So last week I went to New York and I got to preview the new Sony A9 III. And typically the way that works is you get to preview a product and then you give a first impressions video. This camera is very different. So Sony have essentially made the first global shutter full frame camera, which is pretty amazing. And the reason I didn't put the video out immediately is because I wanted to think a little bit about this. So we're going to do something a little bit different in this video. I'm going to rewind. I'm going to play the stuff that I filmed in New York, and then we're going to come back because I had the camera and I can show you all the cool stuff on it. And then we'll come back to present day Ted, and I will talk about some of my first impressions because I think it's a very important camera and there's a lot to unpack here. So let's go back a week to New York City. All right, welcome back, everyone. It has been a while since we've done a good hotel room video, but I am in New York City tonight. Sony has been gracious enough to invite me up here to take a first look at the brand new A9 III. This is an extraordinarily significant camera in pretty much the history of camera making, and that's what I want to talk a little bit about in this video. I spent most of the day shooting on this, done a lot of burst rate shooting, a lot of sports types of things, and I've also done some candid and just kind of standard shooting as well. And I want to talk about the significance of what we have now, which is essentially, well, it's not essentially, it is a global shutter. This is something that we've been waiting for years in digital photography. And if you're not familiar with what a global shutter is, now a global shutter means that every pixel on the sensor fires exactly at the same time when you press the shutter button. This is very different than the standard that we have in most digital cameras today, which we call a CMOS sensor. The CMOS sensor is pretty good, but the way that it works is it actually scans. So it goes left to right, line by line, top to bottom. And it does it very quickly, but the result is because they're not firing in unison. If there's any motion in your image at all, if you're doing video, it is prone to rolling shutter, or the jello effect, we sometimes refer to this as. There's other limitations too. Usually you have a flash sync speed of around 1/200th of a second. Some cameras go up to 1/250th of a second. Now, one of the greatest innovations in the last 20 years, I think, was when Sony developed the stacked CMOS sensor. So essentially you had two layers. There was a memory layer on that sensor, which was able to offset some of that, and it gave you the ability to shoot like 20 frames a second. It reduced the jello shutter, or the rolling shutter, greatly. That was a seriously good innovation. That's what drives a lot of cameras today on the high end. The global shutter is next level, and I think this is something that probably is one of those innovations in photography that is going to change cameras forever. It just is. And so what I want to do is break this down a little bit and talk about what this means for you as a photographer, or even if you're shooting video. So with still shooting, this means that you get shutter speeds up to 1/80,000th of a second. The other key thing here is that you do get flash sync at all shutter speeds. So you can shoot flash, and I have some images that I did where you can shoot a portrait where somebody's backlit by the sun. You see that in the top of the frame, and I used just Sony's basic flash, which isn't a very expensive flash. Used it in manual mode to figure out how I wanted my exposure to lay out, but it gets results. Another great thing about global shutters is that if you're shooting sports, wildlife, things that move quickly, you can now shoot up to 120 frames per second blackout free. And by the way, the viewfinder in here is the 9 million dot. It's amazing. It's really good, and it's such a cool experience to shoot with this. Now, I will say this, and Sony did some changes on this camera that I think are going to be very beneficial for photographers who do shoot high speeds. You don't always want to shoot 120 frames a second. You're going to come back with a card filled up. In fact, I filled up an 80 gigabyte card today, and I'm not really looking forward to going through those images tomorrow, but the fact is you can do it. So the reality is that you probably don't want to shoot 120 frames a second all the time. You might be shooting slower. You might want something that's as slow as, let's say, 10 or 20 frames a second, which is fine. We now have a custom function button on the front of the camera, right under where your fingers are going to be on the grip. And the way this comes initially, you can set it up to do anything, but the way it defaults is this is actually going to give you a temporary burst speed while you're holding that button down of 120 frames a second. So if you're shooting something at 20 frames a second, 30 frames a second, and you need that short burst, you anticipate it coming, you can just hold that down and you were at 120 frames a second, and it's pretty amazing. So the A9 has always been billed as the sports camera because it has the high-speed burst rate shooting speed. So it makes sense for sports and wildlife photographers to be interested in this camera. 24 megapixels is usually enough for that type of work, but I would actually argue that this is the camera that is going to really bridge that gap between still shooters and video shooters, because the video in here is absolutely outstanding. We can now shoot in S-Log 3, there's S-Cinetone, we have more profiles available. We can also shoot shoot up to 120 frames per second of video with no rolling shutter, which is absolutely amazing. This is about a 5x slowdown when you use the S and Q modes. And you can do this without any crop at all. And this is very unusual for cameras now because CMOS sensors, it has to do with the readout speed of that sensor, the way it's scanning. You can only get so much speed before it just doesn't work. So the solution is to crop in on the image so you get an APS-C picture per se. Well, this one you don't have to worry about any of that. You can certainly shoot it as an APS-C camera and you can crop that way, but that would be by choice. You're not doing it because it's a technical limitation. That's something that is very key to this camera. So I think the video output is just unbelievably good with this, and it's going to make this appeal to more people that are not just sports and wildlife still shooters. This is going to be a really versatile setup, and it's pretty amazing. Another thing that you're going to notice about this camera is Sony have done probably one of the biggest redesigns of just the ergonomics on any camera that I've seen. Now, if you look at the lineage of all of the full-frame mirrorless cameras that Sony has done, they stick to the same body design for a while, and then they start to make slight changes. And it's interesting, if you go all the way back to the A7, the original, or the A7S, the first A7R, they are radically different. This one, a lot of thought has been put into the ergonomic design on this. And on the grip side of the camera, the top plate has been redesigned. It fits better in your hand. It's a deeper grip. I mentioned the custom function button that falls under your fingers too. It is a much better design. This is something that I really like. It's been something I've shot on all day. It's very comfortable. Another thing that this camera features that I really like, I already talked about the 9.1 million dot EVF, which is awesome, but the rear screen is the flip out variety that also you can flip around and you can use like a non-flip screen as well. It's the same one that we saw on the A7R5. It's one that I really like. It kind of splits the difference, and people who are in one camp or the other, well, it's the best for both. So that's something that's a really nice addition to this as well. And another thing that's really interesting about this camera is the drive selection dial. You have all your modes, but then there's this asterisk. This is something I had to ask about, and one of the things that I'm dealing with on this camera is this is very early firmware. This camera is not due to come out until next spring, so we're still a ways away. And I'm not sure whether it's in here or not, or whether I just couldn't find it. But when you set it to the asterisk, it's a way of changing your drive selection from being on the top. So if you're a photographer, you're shooting sports, and you want to switch between your speed modes a lot, that's something that you can actually set it to the asterisk, and now you can do it in the menu system. So I don't know whether it's in the function menu. I need to get some clarity on that, but that is forthcoming, and that's actually a really nicely thought out detail. One of my favorite features on the A9 III, believe it or not, was not so much the burst rate shooting, but it's the pre-capture function, which we finally have on a Sony camera. So this enables me, if I'm shooting at really high frame rates, if I don't push the trigger and I just miss something, it is able to capture up to a second of pre-burst shooting before that it keeps in memory and then writes to the card so you don't accidentally miss the shot. That's one of those features that I never thought was going to be really important to me, but when I was doing burst rate shooting speeds today, it's something that really helps. Sometimes you're just a little bit behind on reacting to something, and to have that information and have those images written to the card pretty much means you're not going to miss your shot. It's very cool. Okay, so back to the present now, and I've had an entire week now, so I've been able to download all of my images, go through them. And I want to talk about image quality. I want to talk about this camera. Now, this is a sports camera that Sony have put together, so it can shoot up to 120 frames per second, which is very impressive. However, you do fill up cards really quickly, and you end up with a lot of images. And this is one thing that I don't particularly like about high-speed shooting. But I have gone through, and I want to share some of my first impressions with you. So the first thing I want to address is the base ISO of this camera. It is 250, which is pretty high for a base ISO. Typically, cameras come in around 100 or sometimes even 64 ISO. This one is 250. Sony are a little bit mysterious as to why. They haven't really gone on record as stating. They've stated that the image quality is excellent, and going through these images, it is pretty good. I will say that at 250, you would expect it to be a little cleaner in certain circumstances. This is really all relative, and it's hard to actually address because I don't have access to see the RAW files. Nobody does. And when you have JPEG files, there probably is a little bit of noise suppression that's going on, and they're being cleaned up. Having said that, if you're a sports photographer and you're going to probably be shooting JPEG and not RAW, it is pretty impressive in terms of image quality, and you can see that in these images. My guess is that it has to do with the sensitivity on that global sensor, and so if the sensitivity is less than, let's say, something that's backside illuminated or even this dual stack CMOS, the technology that we have today, this is new tech. And it is very possible that they're just having to push that in camera. So the base ISO is just going to be kind of high. Having said that, for a sports camera, you're probably not going to be shooting lower than 250, so it probably is okay. And again, we'll have to wait until we can see the raw files till we can really pick this apart and see how far you can push the images on this camera in terms of light sensitivity. But my first impressions are that at 250, I feel like it's probably not as clean as other cameras. This is just a guess until I'm able to compare them, but the camera does seem to catch up. So when you're up at 6400 ISO, it does seem to be comparable to CMOS. So whatever is happening in the processing side of this camera is certainly very good. Now, again, I was pretty limited in the shooting situations that I was in, as I had very limited time with this camera, but all in all, I think the color looks just fine. I think the images look beautiful. And one thing that I want to say that is a testament to Sony lenses, particularly that new 300mm that came out, Sony actually sent that to me, and I had it for a few days before I went to New York, and it rained the entire time here, so I didn't get to shoot on it much when it was here with me. But I did shoot on it some in New York, and it is impressive. All of the modern Sony lenses are extremely good, and sometimes when you zoom in on these files, and this is only a 24 megapixel camera, when you zoom in and you can see, like in this image, the sand that's coming off of the volleyball player's hand, or probably the ball, it is amazing the resolution that these are capable of. Another thing that I want to address is flash sync. And so one thing that's really cool is this camera is capable of shutter speeds. There's no shutter in the camera, it's all electronic. But the shutter will fire at a shutter speed of 1/80,000th of a second, which is very impressive. And it will technically flash sync all the way up to 1/80,000th of a second. And however, there is a big difference between using a high-speed sync flash that's on camera versus studio strobes. I did notice there are some limitations to this camera. So for instance, if you didn't have the flash attached in high-speed sync, or at least manual, that you actually were capped out at 1/16,000th of a second. And again, this is something I'll have to test when I actually have a camera and I can put it through more paces than just having it for a few hours. So this will be interesting to be seen. Now, there is a mode in the camera where you can do a test shot and it will measure the delay between firing the shutter and then when your peak light performance comes up. And so that's actually very handy. And again, it's something I haven't tested. It's just something that was talked about. So that's something I'm really excited about to see. So one thing that's very interesting is, since I've been to New York and I had hands-on with the camera, you know, I've been wanting to do this video, and it's just like trying to think through it. We have a camera that is very early release. This doesn't come out for the next 5 months or so, which makes it kind of hard because I do know that it's very beta firmware that we were shooting with, and it just makes it very difficult because this is a complex camera. We're talking about a global shutter. This is something that we've been talking about since the early CMOS cameras for a long time, and even the last 10 years I can remember that this is something that a lot of people talk about, or how close are we to having a global shutter? Once that comes out, that's going to change everything. I think all of those things are true, and that's why I wanted to be very careful about what I was saying in this video. And I think it's, for most cameras, it's easy to get into the hype cycle and throw a video up and talk about the features you like because it's a camera and a system that you're familiar with, and global shutter is something that is very new. I will say this, that I feel like Sony, from what I can tell so far, I can't read the raw files, I haven't had extensive time with the camera, I think they've done an awesome job with this. I think it's going to be really good. Is it going to be a game changer? Absolutely. But one thing you have to remember is we're on generation 1. This is the very first camera with a global shutter on it. Very interesting to me, though, is where we're going to be in the next 5 years when we have more than one camera that has a global shutter. When you start to see this on multiple models, and then also from a technology perspective, what we're able to do with it. And I think that's a little bit of a hump. I mean, I've been very critical with Nikon when they've done their stacked dual CMOS sensor configuration cameras, so the Z9, the Z8, that you don't have a physical shutter anymore. And the same holds true with Sony. And so in fairness, that's something I've been critical about because as a photographer, you're so used to that haptic feedback of feeling when the shutter goes down as a photographer. You know you've taken the image, and that's something that is not on any of these cameras. You've got the cartoon camera noise or you have complete silence. There is visual indicators, but that's just something as a photographer that I'm used to, and it's something that I've been pretty critical about. I know not everybody agrees, but that's the way I see it. And I think it's also worth noting that when I get asked by friends, do you recommend, should I pre-order an A9 III? And I always say it depends. It depends on what you need. If you need high-speed shooting, absolutely. I mean, that's what this camera is designed for. And the global shutter is exciting. If you need the high shutter speeds of 1/80,000th of a second, I mean, that's awesome. Generally for flash photography, you don't. So it becomes a little bit of a special use case, and I think it'll be interesting to see what we're able to do with global shutter. Obviously, video is going to benefit because we're going to get rid of jello shutter completely, but how is this going to impact cameras moving forward? And that's what's interesting to me, and I would love to know what you guys think. This is a subject I will explore more when I get a hands-on and some more time with the A9 III, which I can't wait to do because I really am really excited about this. Then I'll share my impressions with you then also, so we'll do a full review later on. And the camera doesn't come out for a while, so we'll see how soon that is. But drop me a comment if you got any questions, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Until then, later.